I want to welcome you to our final Center for Public Affairs event of 2011. Hard to believe that it's almost over. We are putting together our 2012 calendar, and it promises to be just as exciting. We've had some great speakers this year and a lot of memorable centennial events, which I hope you have all enjoyed. I wanted to tell you a little bit of a story here in introducing Pete. In 1985, as a very junior staffer at the White House, I met and worked with a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who was asked to write the official biography of Ronald Reagan. For the next 10 years, he wandered around the country. He opened hundreds of archival boxes. He talked to literally thousands of people who knew or thought they knew Ronald Reagan. He was always searching for what the secret of Ronald Reagan's character was and what made him the man he became. He never did figure it out. At that same time in 1985, President Reagan had only been my boss for barely a year. But I felt pretty strongly even then that there wasn't much of a mystery to this man who, although I'm proud to claim him as a Californian, can trace his beginnings back to a simple all-American upbringing in the Midwest. And I venture to say that our special guest today, Pete Hannaford, had the same impression of Ronald Reagan from very early on in their relationship when he met him back in the 1960s. When he was asked to join the staff during Governor Reagan's second term in Sacramento, Pete agreed very readily, although I'm told it was with a little persuasion from his roommate, Irene. And he has been part of the Reagan family ever since. Following his time in Sacramento as an assistant to the governor and director of public affairs, he created his own public relations firm, whose primary client was Ronald Reagan. It was during that time that Ronald Reagan handwrote and delivered thousands of radio addresses to people across the nation. He ran a tough presidential campaign in 1976 against the incumbent, Jerry Ford, and then became the Republican candidate for president in 1980. After the election, and for the next 8 years, Pete Hannaford chose to stay connected to Ronald Reagan as a private citizen through his firm and the campaign organization, offering political advice and other wise counsel from outside the grounds of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He remained close to President Reagan in the post-presidential years, and that's when I came to know Pete very close. But it wasn't until early in 2010, after 40 years of knowing this man, when a gentleman in a Q&A session asked Pete what he thought was the source or sources of Ronald Reagan's character. And without missing a beat, Pete Hannaford answered in one word, Illinois, and realized it was time to document this early part of the Reagan story. Pete has written many other books on Ronald Reagan, his ranch, his quotes, his stories, and his politics. And he told me earlier today that it occurred to him there probably wasn't much else to write about Ronald Reagan. But it hit him that day that, yes, it wasn't abundantly clear where Ronald Reagan really began. From the old country in Ireland to the new world in the Midwest, and then to California, Reagan's roots traces members of the Reagan family to all the places where they lived and worked, and where Ronald Reagan lived. Pete tells us about the small towns Ronald Reagan grew up in, the small but very impactful college he attended, and the austerity of the Reagan family during the Great Depression. We learn a little more in depth about his childhood and his parents, Jack and Nell, and his brother Neil, as well as a man the president knew as Coach McKenzie, or Mac, as he used to tell us about him in the post-presidential years. We begin to understand quite clearly where Ronald Reagan learned self-reliance, self-confidence, modesty, optimism, loyalty, tolerance, determination, good humor, and a reverence for God. As Pete tells us, some of these towns are a little bigger today, some about the same now as then, and some a little smaller. But if you were to spend some time visiting them, and he did, it would not be hard to imagine that the pace of life today in these places is not a great deal different from what it was when Ronald Reagan was young. Pete Hannaford knew Ronald Reagan for the last half of his life, but not the first half. In Reagan's roots, Pete went back and explored the people and places that formed the character of Ronald Reagan. Pete is going to tell us a little bit about this journey, and then he's agreed to take some questions. And don't hesitate to ask him questions about the other parts of Ronald Reagan's life, as Pete has known him a very long time. It gives me great pleasure in introducing a good friend of mine, Pete Hannaford.
Thank you, Joanne, for your kind introduction. It's hard to believe in a way that Ronald Reagan's centennial year is coming to an end, but it is. This is the last month of it. And it hardly seems possible to think of him as being 100 years old. Because in photographs, and you see them here in the museum, and we see them in books and magazines and other places, we still see that smiling face, seemingly forever young, with those smiling eyes that always went with a smile on his face. And as for his ideas, well, they seem forever young because they are. They are based on principles that he learned as a young man and were later translated into government policies. And distilled to their essence, they were such things as personal integrity, financial responsibility, and limited government. But what about his character? Joanne touched on this. About 15 months ago, it was spring last year, I was at the University of Virginia to give a talk on the topic of President Reagan's strategy for bringing the Cold War to a successful conclusion. Now, at the end of the talk, of course, the host invited the audience to ask questions, and I thought they'd be about that topic. I was quite surprised when the first man who got up asked this question that Joanne referred to. He said, "Can you tell us the sources of Ronald Reagan's character?" Well, that question came as a surprise, but I found myself saying after a pause of several seconds, yes, in a word, Illinois. Because the characteristics that we do associate with him, self-reliance, self-confidence, modesty, optimism, loyalty, tolerance, good humor, determination, and reverence for God, all came from his forebears, his teachers, his coaches, athletic and drama, his clergy, the circumstances and the culture of his youth, and most of all, his parents, Jack and Nell Reagan. All of these people were in what you would describe as the northwestern corner of rural Illinois. If you looked at a map of Illinois and you bisected or cut it into 4 pieces, it would be the upper left-hand corner where all of this occurred. And all of his first 21 years were spent in that area, that small area, except for about 9 months in Chicago, and he was only 4 years old when that happened. Now, the Irish, Scots, English, and others who settled the fertile farmland of that area brought with them values ingrained for generations. Most had worked the land and felt very attached to it, although they were tenant farmers. They didn't own the land. But hard work was taken for granted, along with thrift, family loyalty, and self-reliance. But if they could only own their own land in the New World, they would have an affirmation that their fondest dream had come true. So in Ronald Reagan's case, it began with his 2 sets of great-grandparents. On the Reagan side, they left Ireland because of the potato famine. Michael O. Reagan, who when he got to London changed his name from the Irish spelling to the English spelling, and married his sweetheart. They found their way across the Atlantic and ended up in rural Illinois, near a town called Fulton, which is almost on the Mississippi River. He learned about the Homestead Act, and he filed a claim realizing that within 4 to 5 years, if he could prove that he'd made the land productive, first he had to clear it of trees and shrubs, make it productive, and build a building on it. Those requirements were necessary. He would own the land. And by the 1860 census, he was described as a farmer owning real estate. Well, his son worked on the family land also, but then he moved to the town of Fulton where he worked at the grain elevator. And that man's son, John, better known as Jack, was to become Ronald Reagan's father. Now, Reagan's great-grandfather Wilson on his mother's side landed in Nova Scotia and also made his way to that part of Illinois. Of course, he didn't know the Reagans. And his son, Thomas, married a girl named Mary Ann Elsie, who'd come to New York, through New York, with her family. But her father died shortly after they arrived. Her mother had some contacts in Elgin, Illinois, and took her brood with her to Elgin. And then they moved to Fulton, where Nell was born and grew up. Now, as the daughter of Tom and Mary Ann Reagan, Nell was to become Ronald Reagan's mother. She was bright, energetic, and imbued with a strong desire to help people, now that she acquired from her mother, who was a very religious woman. Her mother made Nell promise on her deathbed that she would carry on her own life's work of doing good for other people and seeing the good things in other people. Nell took this very much to heart, and Mary Ann had a favorite poem that she made Nell memorize and recite. It went like this: I live for those who love me, for the heaven that smiles above me, and awaits my spirit too, for the human ties that bind me, for the task God assigned me, for the bright hopes left behind me, and the good that I can do. So that became Nell's sort of watchword in life, that series of promises. Meanwhile, as a young man, Jack, who had left school after the 6th grade, made his way to Fulton. He'd been born in Fulton. His parents died when he was 6 of tuberculosis. He was farmed out to an aunt and an uncle nearby in Iowa, across the river. Came back after a while, went to work in a dry goods store in Fulton selling shoes. But he discovered a liking for alcohol. Now, he was good-looking and charming, and he managed to charm all the young women of the town, but almost universally, their parents disapproved of him as a potential son-in-law. The only person who didn't was Nell, who was very smitten with him, and they fell in love, and she was determined to put aside all objections, and she did, and they were married in Fulton in 1904. Well, Nell became used to Jack's weekend drinking. She didn't like it, but she hoped that something could be done to change his pattern. He used to go out with his brother, William, and who was a very hard drinker, and they would spend the weekend drinking. But she seemed to understand that what Jack really wanted out of life was recognition that he was a worthwhile person, that he had self-worth. He wasn't particularly interested in making huge amounts of money. He wanted to provide for his wife and himself, but no, it was really the development of his own self-worth that he was interested in, and she saw this. Well, she decided what they needed to do was change their venue of where they were living. Jack had worked at the same store for 8 years, so he was a reliable employee in that sense. But she wanted to get him away from the influence of his brother, and she persuaded him to move to Tampico, a small town 26 miles away, where the local dry goods store, owned by a Mr. Pitney, had an opening. And Jack was hired, again, largely to sell shoes. They rented a flat above a bakery right across the street from the Pitney store. Their first son, John Neal, who was later called Neal always, until he acquired the nickname Moon, named after Moon Mullins, a very popular comic strip character of the day. Well, Neal was born there in that flat in 1908. A Catholic priest came to baptize the infant, and Jack, who was a Catholic, had failed to say anything about this to Nell, who was a member of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, which is a Presbyterian offshoot. Well, the priest was standing right there, so Nell agreed to the baptism, but she also made Jack promise that as soon as their children were old enough, they could choose their own religion, and she made him stick to that. Well, on February 6, 1911, early in the morning, in the midst of one of the heaviest blizzards on record in that area, Ronald Wilson Reagan was born. Now, Jack worked his way through the blizzard to the doctor's house, only to find a note on the door from the doctor saying, "I'm off on an emergency." So then he went to a midwife's house, and she was there, and he brought her back to the flat, where their son was born. And when Jack finally saw his new 10-pound son, he said, "For a little bit of a Dutchman, he sure makes a hell of a lot of noise." Well, thus, Ronald Reagan had suddenly acquired the nickname Dutch, by which he was known by nearly everybody for the next 26 years until he got to Hollywood. And as you may know, when he wrote to former classmates and friends and anybody who knew him in his youth, and you've probably seen it if you've seen his the book about his correspondence, he always signed his letters Dutch to these people because that's what they knew him as. Well, I will say apropos of his birthplace, in the flat above the bakery, that one day in 1978, Ronald Reagan and I were driven by the White House on our way to the airport. There'd been a day that he had of meetings on Capitol Hill, and it was finished. We were going home to California. And as we drove by the White House, I asked him what he thought of the idea of possibly living there one day. And he smiled, and he said, "It'd be okay. When I was a kid, we lived above the store." Well, with Jack's good sense of humor and sense of egalitarianism, and Nell's religious training that taught her that all people were created equal, the Reagan boys grew up in a household completely free of envy and prejudice. Now, Jack was a good shoe salesman, but he felt that his career was not taking off. This is a pretty small town, after all. He decided they should move to the big time in Chicago. And there was an opening at the Fair store, F-A-I-R, and the Fair department store described itself in those days as the world's largest department store. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it was very big. It covered an entire city block on the south side of Chicago and was 9 stories tall. So it must have had 200 or 300 employees. And Jack thought, well, if I could just get into a big store, my career would really move. It did not. And we're not sure. They moved in January 1915, a few days before Ronald Reagan had his 4th birthday. And they left there in early December, so it would have been about 10 months or so that they were in Chicago. They'd rented a flat. I saw it for the first time, not the flat, but the building for the first time just a week ago. It's still there, although maybe not for long. It's completely surrounded by the University of Chicago, and they have an interest in wanting to replace it. But that's a story for another day. But at any rate, it was walking distance to the Fair store where he worked. I'm not sure quite why they left Chicago. His drinking may have been a contributing factor. The store may have been making personnel adjustments. I think something more likely is that he had expected this to be a golden period for his business, and it wasn't. And being a small-town boy, always working in a small setting with only a few colleagues, he knew them, they knew him, they knew all the customers. Suddenly, he's in a very large city. He's punching a time clock, which he'd never done before. You go to lunch, and you come back from lunch when you're told. There are all kinds of rules and regulations in this big store, and I think he chafed at that and decided, no, this isn't going to work. Well, she had a sister living in the town of Galesburg, to the northwest, and again in the northwest corner of Illinois, and she was working in a dry goods store, and there was an opening for a shoe salesman, and she made the introduction. He got the job, and they moved to Galesburg. They were there for about 17 months, and then he heard about an opening in Monmouth, another small city, and they moved there and lived there for about 2 years. Then he got a letter from Mr. Pitney, the dry goods man in Tampico. Mr. Pitney's eyesight was failing, and he feared that he would either have to sell or retire. And he liked Jack, and when Jack left, they were on good terms. So he asked him to come back and help him manage the store, and he also held out a promise of a part ownership in another store that Mr. Pitney owned in Dixon. Well, Jack thought that really was the answer to a prayer. That would be really good for his career. So they packed everything up and they went back to Tampico, the second time there. This time they lived in another building. They didn't live over the bakery, which by now, by the way, was the First National Bank of Tampico. the bakery was. They liked being back in Dixon. There were quite a few people they knew, and the boys, being a little older by then, had a wonderful time playing out of doors with friends, going swimming in the nearby canal, and so forth. Now, throughout those years, Nell delved more deeply into her church work. She gave support to any who needed it. On the weekends after church services, she would go to the county jail and minister to the prisoners, reading them Bible stories, taking them cookies. She went to hospitals. She went to nursing homes. Anybody in need of succor got it from Nell. Well, she joined a group at the church that dramatized Bible stories by singing and reciting, and she began taking young Ronald with her as her, quote, assistant. And for all we know, his interest in drama was kindled at these events when he was so young. Also, when he was not quite 5, his mother began to teach him to read. She would run her finger down the page as she recited it so that he could look over her shoulder and see the words she was saying while he was hearing it. And one evening, Jack saw him. He was sprawled on the parlor floor looking intently at the day's newspaper. And Jack said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Reading." And Jack said, "So read me something," whereupon he read a story from that day's newspaper. Well, Jack was so astonished that he ran next door and brought the neighbors over and asked Ronald to give a demonstration to the neighbors, which he did. So, and his 5th grade teacher, a woman named Nellie Darby, was the first we know of who remarked on his great ability to remember dates and places. Years later, when I went to work for then Governor Reagan as Director of Public Affairs in his governor's office, a colleague warned me not to send anything to the governor's inbox unless it really was important. My friend said he thinks everything in the inbox is important, so he stuffs it in his briefcase at the end of the day, if he hasn't seen it already, takes it home, reads it after supper, and the next morning when he comes back, he's up on all of the items in there. He said, as a matter of fact, dynamite wouldn't blast those facts out of his head. Well, I learned that lesson well, and I tried to remember never to send anything that wasn't important. So actually, the Reagan memory came into full flower when he was in the movie business. He typically learned not only his lines, but those of several of the other players as well, in order to better understand how his character fit into the whole picture. In 1920, the Reagans moved to Dixon, and this is the town that he ultimately called his hometown. He once said years later, he said, "You know, everybody has a place they can go back to that they call home." He said, "For me, that's Dixon." The boys developed hobbies and enjoyed sports. And that was when Ronald Reagan realized he was nearsighted. Now, in football, which came to be his passion, he would play lineman even if there's only one other player on his side, because they played with the neighbor boys across the street, a pair of brothers. One was in the back, one was in the line, and he was always the lineman. The reason he was the lineman was he couldn't see beyond the big blur that was just standing opposite him, and he could just throw himself at the blur and try to tackle him or hold the guy back. On the other hand, if he tried to play baseball, he couldn't see the baseball until it nearly hit him in the face. So he thought, baseball's not my sport. But ironically, of course, years later, he was at WHO radio in Des Moines, he was the star announcer of the Cubs baseball games every day. Well, on one Sunday drive in the country, he tried on his mother's glasses, and he was amazed to find that he could read signs and see other features in great detail that he'd never seen before. He thought that everybody, when they saw a tree in the distance, they saw a green blob on top of a stick. When they saw a person walking down the sidewalk, a few yards away, he thought everybody saw just, blank blurs, that people didn't have features unless they came up close. He was amazed to see that he could see all of these people. So the next day, his mother had him outfitted with a pair of dark-rimmed, heavy glasses. He did not like the eyeglasses. However, he loved reading and seeing. And he especially liked going to the movies, and he no longer had to sit in the front row in order to see anything. His favorites were westerns and sports films. And he also began checking out 2 books a week in the Dixon Library. Now, the reason I know that's true is that I met the librarian several months ago, and she wasn't the librarian in 1920. But this lady said, you know, the tradition here, and we've checked the records, was on average he was taking out 2 books a week for a long period of time. And when you walk into the Dixon Library, as you come up the stairs, there is a plaque on the wall that has the numbers of Ronald Reagan's library card. It's enshrined up there on the wall. So he was a star at the Dixon Library even back at that age. Well, there were less happy days in those times for them, too. One evening when he was 11, it would have been the fall or early winter, there was snow coming down, he got home late in the day and he found his father was passed out drunk on the front porch in his overcoat. His first impulse was to walk around and go upstairs to his room, but his conscience told him he could not do that. So, mind you, at 11, he was fairly short and he was very thin. He was not robust, but he was determined, and he managed to pull his father up by his overcoat, up the stairs, and believe me, those are steep stairs in that house. But he got him upstairs and he got him to bed. Well, unfortunately, Jack's drinking bouts became longer and more often, and he became cynical, which was a sharp contrast to his normally warm storytelling self, which was his natural way of being. Now, Nell, through all of this, never wavered in her belief that alcoholism was a disease and that people who were its victims should not be condemned for something over which they had very little or no control. In 1922, that's also when he was, well, by then he was 11 years old also, he came across a book that Nell had left on the parlor table called That Printer of Udell's. Now, this was written by a then very popular novelist named Harold Bell Wright, and this book had sold over 1 million copies when it was published from its publication date in 1903. This was a story of redemption and success, and it had a very profound effect on the young Ronald Reagan. After he read it a few days later, he said to his mother that he would like to be baptized in the Christian church. And so one day in 1922, both he and his brother Neil were baptized in that church. And 2 years later, Dutch was teaching Sunday school in the church. And another demonstration, early demonstration of his leadership, when he said he would teach Sunday school, there wasn't really any place to teach the students except the furnace room, which was very dark and hardly had one bare bulb light hanging from the ceiling. He rallied several of the children who were in Sunday school to work with him, and over the course of several weekends, they managed to patch the plaster, paint the thing a light color, put in better lights, and put in the furniture that was set aside for the children, and taught the Sunday school there. And there is a painting at one of the several Reagan museums in Dixon showing him and his friends putting the furnace room into the Sunday school. Well, when he was 14, puberty set in. So he went from being short and scrawny to tall, muscular, and good-looking. Now, just as Nell was constantly helping people in need of moral support, the sports-loving Dutch found a much more physical way to help people by saving lives. The local YMCA had a swimming program at Dixon's Lowell Park, which was on the Rock River, which is a very swift river. The Park Commission had been threatening to close the swimming program, which was very popular, because there'd been several drownings in these fast currents. Now, Reagan was already an excellent swimmer, and he'd taken the life-saving course at the YMCA. He appealed to the concessionaires to hire him as the so-called professional lifeguard. They'd never had one. They agreed. He worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day for the next 7 summers, loving it from beginning to end. He would sit in his lifeguard stand, and all the girls would come flocking around to talk with him. So no wonder. And at the park, he found an old log on the beach, and he carved a notch on the log every time he saved a life. And by the end of summer 1932, his last summer there were 77 notches in the log. He was very proud of that. And in fact, his role as a lifeguard, that is to say, being always ready to save a drowning person, was a bit of a foretaste of his role in public life. That is, ready to save the nation from drowning in domestic and foreign troubles. Well, during his high school years, he discovered Margaret Cleaver. They became steadies through high school and all the way through college. Now, Margaret was the daughter of the Reverend Ben Cleaver, the new pastor of the Christian church. And he was a man who would be one of several older role models for Ronald Reagan. And he had a major and positive effect on the young man. Now, Dutch admired Jack's opposition to racial and religious intolerance and his love of good stories. Nevertheless, Jack's drinking was an ever-present part of their lives. And Dutch seemed, therefore, to cultivate both a public and a private self, you might say. In his private world, he was coping with how to deal with Jack's drinking. Dixon was not a very big city then, it's not one now, and he was widely known as a drinking man. And Dutch didn't want to be thought of as the son of the town drunk, but he realized people would describe him that way. So in his public life, he was unfailingly cheerful and polite and charming with people, and he became very popular, widely popular. But in his private thoughts, and he kept more and more of his thoughts about Jack's problem to himself, he was very private. This was the privacy that Edmund Morris could never discover, the so-called biography of Ronald Reagan. By the time he was a senior at Dixon High School, Dutch found the perfect outlet for his public self, the school's dramatic club. Now, B.J. Frazier was the club's advisor and a teacher, and he found Dutch to be an apt pupil. Also, Margaret joined that club, so they were doing this together. Ronald Reagan would fit any role he was given very easily. And he was also, at that time, a star on the Dixon football team. As I said, that was his passion, but the drama was becoming a new additional passion. Well, Nell wanted both of her boys to go to college. Neil didn't want to, and when he graduated about 2 years before Dutch, he went to work for the local cement company, making what he thought was a lot of money. So he was happy, although he did end up at Eureka some years later. But on the other hand, Dutch had been saving money all through these lifeguard years, the summer money, and by the time he was a senior, he didn't have quite enough money to pay for a full year's tuition and room and board at college. He wanted to go to Eureka College. He had two reasons for doing that. One, the son of the late minister at the Christian church, a young man named Garland Wagner, about 4 years older than Ronald Reagan, had been a great star on the Dixon football team and was now a star on the Eureka College team. And he saw Garland Wagner as the kind of player he wanted to be, maybe even a professional someday. That was reason number one. Reason number two, or maybe it was in reverse, was Margaret. She was going to go to Eureka College. That was already a settled fact. And he wanted to be with her. So she packed the car to go up to Eureka one day. It's about 100 miles southeast of Dixon, and he accompanied her. Now, he'd written ahead to the dean of students to ask for an appointment, and the dean, a man named Sam Harrod, granted the appointment. He thought he could persuade Mr. Harrod of his prowess in football as a reason for getting a scholarship. So they had their meeting, and Mr. Harrod said, well, I can only give academic scholarships, and I can't give you one because your grades aren't good enough. However, I will introduce you to the athletic director, who's also the football coach, Ralph McKenzie. And he did. Now, both men liked him. They liked his sense of determination his energy, his earnestness, and they did decide to give him an athletic scholarship to cover the other half of his tuition. He got a job dishwashing at the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity house. He also joined the house, and that covered the rest of his room and board for that first year. And of this first experience, Ronald Reagan said, I fell head over heels in love with Eureka College from the day I first got there. Well, Mackenzie, the athletic director, was only a few years older than his players. He'd been a star football player and a basketball player at Eureka. There was one of his last football games, they beat another school by 52-0, and he scored all the points. So he was quite a hero. Well, despite Ronald Reagan's determination to make the varsity that year, Mackenzie put him on the substitute squad. In fact, the most humiliating thing was he had 5 little substitute squads, and he put Ronald Reagan on the 5th. Well, Reagan decided he did that because the coach didn't like him. And here was such a likable guy. Of course, the reason the coach did that was because he was nearsighted. And in those days, as you probably know, the helmets were odd-looking by today's standards, and there was no place to put a face guard to hold glasses, so you couldn't wear your glasses. Therefore, Mackenzie thought, I'll give him a try at this and see how he does. Mackenzie knew what a good swimmer he was, and he said to him, I think where you really ought to concentrate your effort is in competitive swimming. He did that, and he won almost everything he ever swam in. He was excellent. Well, Reagan quickly absorbed the sense of solidarity on this little college campus. They had 235 students at that time. It's about 800 today. He later wrote, we had a special spirit at Eureka that bound us all together, much as a poverty-stricken family is bound. Well, by then, things were not so good economically in rural Illinois. Furthermore, cultural changes were still sweeping the country. This was the era of so-called flaming youth. Now, Eureka students didn't go off the deep end, but they did like to dance, and they sought a relaxation of the rather strict rules of behavior, code of behavior. The president did just the reverse. He made them tougher instead of easier, and this led to very serious trouble. In November that year, this is 1928, it's Ronald Reagan's first year, the college president failed to get the support of the Board of Trustees to cut some courses in order to save money because the school was having a lot of trouble. Among the courses he wanted to cut were several that seniors had to pass in order to get their degree. Well, if you're a senior in November and you're not sure you're going to have these courses to take before you graduate, your anxiety level would be pretty high, and it was. Now, when the trustees would not let him cut the courses, the president offered his resignation. He also delivered shortly thereafter a blistering condemnation of the morals of the campus and the community in which it operated. A group of alums urged the trustees to accept the president's resignation, but they did not do so. Soon after the final football game, the students were scheduled to go home for the Thanksgiving holiday, and few did. They hung around. Well, Leslie Pierce, who was a football star and also the president of Reagan's fraternity house, led a campaign to oust the college president. At 11:45 on the last night before the holiday, Pierce rang the chapel bells on campus for 15 minutes. Students and faculty came running, many in their nightclothes, thinking there was a fire. Well, Pierce and other senior members of the fraternity house decided that a freshman should spell out the student demands, because that class would have staying power for 4 years. Whereas if a senior gave the demands, the president and the trustees might say, well, these folks are self-interested, so we've got to discount what they're saying. That was a good choice. Now then the question was who would give the speech? And they chose Dutch because already they were very impressed by the way his voice projected and his presence and getting up and saying things in class and so forth. So, of course, this would turn out to be, and he didn't know it at the time, his first political speech. He later said, I discovered that night that an audience had a feel to it, and that in the parlance of the theater, the audience and I were together. In the speech when he proposed an all-student strike on their return from the holiday, he didn't have to wait for somebody to say, "I second it." The whole crowd stood up and approved it by acclamation. Well, the ringleaders wrote the statement out and said that the strike would be on when they got back from holiday and it would stay on until the president resigned. They slipped a copy of the statement under the president's door just to make sure he understood what they were talking about. Well, they went off on holiday, and when they came back, the strike started immediately. Only 6 students out of 235 went to class, and 2 of them were the president's daughters. Well, within a few days, the president had resigned. And I'm happy to say Eureka has lived happily ever after. Well, happily, although sometimes it had more financial troubles as the year went on, I've been told, but it's in good sound shape today. Meanwhile, Dutch and Margaret Cleaver had joined the Eureka Student Drama Club, and his on-stage demeanor earned him many positive reviews that noted this sense of presence that he had when he was on stage. Now, this was in a pre-microphone era, and yet his voice carried very nicely even without a microphone. Ellen Johnson, who was the young drama coach, she just joined the faculty that year, saw the talent in Reagan, and she actively encouraged him to develop it. In fact, that year, she sent Margaret and Reagan and some other players to Northwestern University to take part in an annual school or college drama competition of one-act plays. And to everyone's surprise, Eureka College came in second for the entire state. They'd never done this before, so it was quite a new accolade, both to the college, and most especially to Ronald Reagan. One of the judges, who was a drama professor at Northwestern, took him aside and he said, "I think you've got some real talent, and I think you should take some professional acting coaching and courses and look for a career in acting." Well, Reagan was very flattered to hear this from this man, but then he thought to himself, with economic conditions as they are, who would hire an actor these days? You know, there isn't going to be any place for actors. So he put that idea aside. But he did cultivate one pastime that related to it at Eureka, and it took place in the locker rooms after the football games. He would recreate an entire quarter of the game just finished, play by play, using a broomstick as his microphone. Well, he was to learn that his voice was a natural talent. It was clear and mellow with a sense of hope in it. And he learned how to modulate it for intimacy and to expand it for declarations. Coach McKenzie wrote later, he said, you know, every time he put on one of these broadcasts in the locker room, he had us all in stitches because the players in the drama were all his fellow players in the football game. But he threw himself into student activities. He won a letter in track. He became the school swimming coach, basketball team cheerleader, president of the Boosters Club, editor of the yearbook, member of the student senate, as well as the football team. Because by then, of course, he was on the first squad, and he learned why, of course, the coach had held him back in those first years. By the way, after his first year, despite his disappointment, he came out for practice every day, and he never forgot the plays. This impressed the coach very much. And by his senior year, even his grades had gotten a lot better. Well, Eureka's graduating class of 1932 had shrunk to 45 students. Many had become depression dropouts. They had to go home and help the family. They couldn't afford school anymore, various reasons, but quite a few had dropped out. Well, Reagan by then was the senior class president, so he was scheduled to speak at the graduation, and he did. And he spoke about optimism. And yet, like the other graduates on the platform, he was very worried. Would my degree have any meaning? Could I get a job? Well, he had one job for sure for a while, and that was back at Dixon at his lifeguard stand. And when he was there after school, after graduation, he was asked by a prosperous businessman, a Dixon summer resident whose family rented a cabin there in the park, as several families did, from Kansas City, a man named Sid Altshuler. And Mr. Altshuler asked him what he wanted to do when summer was over. Now, Altshuler said, I have many friends in many fields of business, so if it's a field you want to go in and I have a contact, I'll be happy to make introductions for you. Well, Ronald Reagan didn't have an answer for Mr. Altshuler, but he appreciated his offer, and he said he would get back to him in a few days. He did, and when he did, he announced that he wanted to be a radio sports announcer. Well, Mr. Altshuler said, I think that's a good choice. I'm sorry I don't know anybody in the radio business, so I can't help you. But it's a rapidly growing field, and you'll do well. Well, most important thing was that Mr. Altshuler didn't realize it, but by having asked Ronald Reagan that question a few days before, he gave Dutch the self-confidence to draw a conclusion from all the loose thoughts that had been floating around in his head over the last 3 or 4 years. After that, as a matter of fact, he then practiced his play-by-play broomstick broadcasts for the rest of the summer on the beach at Lowell Park. In early September, this is 1932 still, he hitchhiked to Chicago, which was the center of the radio industry in the Middle West. He went to all the big stations. Not one of them would give him an appointment to see anybody. Finally, at the last station, the receptionist was quite sympathetic, and she advised him to try small towns. Many were just getting their first stations started. She said, you know, these big stations only want people with some experience, but small towns will take somebody with no experience, just what seems to be the right amount of talent. Well, that seemed like pretty good advice, but he also thought of 2 things his mother had been telling him about since he was a tot. One was that there would be disappointments in life, and when you find one, don't shrink away from it, don't back away, don't give up, don't feel sorry for yourself. Instead, work around the problem, work over the problem, or start fresh, but keep at it, and you'll find a little ways down the road something good is going to come from that. Well, the corollary to that she taught him for years was that God has a plan for everybody. Not a blueprint, not a timetable, but a plan for the abilities that a person could develop if only they'll put the effort into it. And thinking about those 2 lessons, he thought, yeah, this sounds good. This, along with that receptionist's advice to go to small stations. He made a list of all the towns within a 75-mile radius of Dixon. And he thought he would start with the furthest one and then work back in until he got to the closest one. The furthest one was Davenport, Iowa, right across the Mississippi River. So he borrowed Jack's car, drove the 75 miles to Davenport, and there he called on the manager of WOC, a radio station, the man he called on was Peter MacArthur, the station manager. Now, MacArthur told him that he'd been advertising for an announcer and had auditioned or listened to 94 applicants before picking one. Now, when Reagan heard that, he thought, well, this is the end of my interview. What he's telling me is that I'm sorry, kid, I don't have any jobs. So he got up to walk toward the elevator. Well, MacArthur, a Scot who spoke with a burr and had a very bad case of arthritis, walked with 2 canes, came scuttling after him. And he said, do you think you could make me hear a game and see it? Well, could he ever? So MacArthur led him to a broadcast studio, closed the door, whereupon Reagan recreated the final 20 minutes of one of Eureka's games that last season. Suddenly the door burst open. MacArthur came in and he said, "You did great, you big SOB," and offered him for $5 a job to broadcast that Saturday's college game. And of course he took it. Well, he did so well that he was hired to do all the rest of the games for the station for the rest of the season. And he was really floating on a cloud. But the season ended, of course, and then he thought, my gosh, what am I going to do next? That's the end of my career. When a couple of days later, MacArthur called him and offered him a job as a full-time announcer at $100 a month. Now, in 1932, that was a pretty good salary. So by then, all of the characteristics we think of as Ronald Reagan's had been fully formed. The rest, as they say, is history. But the ideas he put into public life aren't history. They're alive today, and they're being pursued earnestly, pushed by his political heirs. Fiscal responsibility, limiting the size and scope of the federal government, and personal responsibility in one's own life and affairs. Now, his careers took Ronald Reagan out of the heartland, but its values remained in his heart for the rest of his life. Since he made love of his country and its people his life's work, I think he'd approve if I ended my remarks with his favorite Irish prayer. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rain fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Thank you. Be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Hannaford.
Yes.
In studying Ronald Reagan, thank you. In studying Ronald Reagan for a presentation I had to give about a year ago on his time in California as governor, I came across the comment that he took his oath of office at about 12 midnight. Is that true, and why was that so important?
The reason it is true, and the reason it is true is that his predecessor, Pat Brown, had been giving a lot of pardons toward the very end of his term, and incoming Governor Reagan was afraid if he waited until the next day, which would have been the traditional time to take the oath at probably noontime, that Brown would make a whole raft of new pardons at the very end in the last few minutes. So that's why he did this. And by the way, of course, he's the only governor who ever did that before or since. And he had George Murphy, you know, his former fellow actor, great song and dance man, on the platform with him. And he turned to him and he said, "Well, here we are, George, in the night show again." Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Christian church. In your research, did you come across Disciples of Christ?
Well, that is the Christian church. Yeah, and I found that people in that church use the two descriptive names interchangeably. At Eureka College, the president said, "Well, we usually call it Disciples of Christ," but I found at several of the churches that people always said, "We always call it the Christian church." So it's interchangeable.
Were they also called Campbellites? And you said they were offshoot of Presbyterian.
Yeah, they're Calvinists is what they were.
Okay. I was one too.
Others? Yes, sir.
We've heard a lot about Ronald Reagan's love of jelly bellies. Can you tell us how that started?
Well, I think it probably started in childhood, but in terms of his public life, it started when he was governor. And the word got out somehow that he liked jelly beans. And the man who owned the Jelly Belly Company, which was then and still has its main factory near Vacaville, north of San Francisco Bay, got wind of it and delivered some Jelly Bellies to the governor's office as a gift. Promotion, of course, because the word got around. And from then on, there was always a jar of jelly beans on the cabinet table, and other places ultimately, but originally the cabinet table. And I remember Reagan once saying when I first went to work there, he said, "You know, sometimes these meetings will get very heated. You'll get two sides on the same issue arguing back and forth." And he said, "I just start passing the jelly bean jar and everybody has some, and pretty soon everything's calmed down." So it worked. And of course, he took the jelly beans into the White House, and the jelly beans are a great Reagan trademark now. And I understand there's a second Jelly Belly factory, which is in Illinois. So, and they have a lot of them in Illinois, I noticed. Anything to do with Reagan has jelly beans. Anyone else?
Okay. Thank you, Pete, for coming. I know a lot of these people are going to meet you upstairs for a book signing. Before you go, we do have a little gift for you. Actually, it's something that you participated in. It's one of our centennial projects. It's a collection of the president's notes, and Pete was one of the people that I used to establish the provenance of that project. I called Pete on the phone. He always calls me back very quickly, and assured me that, yes, he had seen that book that is now on display in our gubernatorial gallery in the president's hands and in the president's desk drawer. So that book goes back, we think, as far back as GE days. I have yet to find somebody who can give me that kind of provenance, but Pete gave me the gubernatorial provenance, and so we thank him for coming today. We'll see you guys upstairs at the book sale line.